Monticello, the home of Thomas Jefferson. You see that home here in an original watercolor. This is one of the few representations of Monticello when Thomas Jefferson was still living there. And it was actually done as a watercolor that was done by the mother of one of those two girls you see walking along the lawn. And you will see soon how this has evolved over the years. Well, my first visit was 44 years ago. And the first time I went, I was 10 years old, and I loved seeing the house and everything in it. It was fascinating. But this time, I was really interested primarily in the gardens, from the orchards to the trees to the vegetables, and of course, the ornamental flowers. Today, I'm going to be talking primarily about those ornamental flowers. You see, here's a picture I took when I was there, and instead of the trees being around it, you've got some of those original flower beds and this sandy path, which we're going to talk about in a minute, which is the winding path. Now take a look at this aerial view. You see over here is the house, and I'm going to put the labels in. I think I have labels on all of this. We've got the lawn and flowers, we've got the vegetable area, the orchards, and of course the grove of trees as well. Even though the grove was very deliberate, Mr. Jefferson was planting a wide variety of trees, and you can tell that from this view and the different sorts of leaves they are. And the orchards, of course, were a major part of his gardens, and those go off down to the right. Jefferson was a farmer throughout his life, and the vegetables were grown to eat and feed everyone on the farm. The vegetable gardens are fascinating, hearing about how they got the water up from the river, which I guess the river is way over here. If you see my pointer up there, my laser pointer, the river is way back there, and how they brought the water up to water the orchards and the vegetable gardens when they were needed is all very interesting. But for me, I'm still going to buy my vegetables, and I prefer to put my own time into trying to grow flowers. So that's what really interested me. So to look next, this is the actual plan that Jefferson sent to, I think it was his niece, Anne Carey Randolph. He was president when he did this. You can see the writing on the back of this, and then he turned it over and he said, you know, and he did this little sketch of what he was planning to do in retirement. So just like many of us, all of these things he did were his retirement years of working on this garden. Even though he had been a gardener his entire life and kept exceptionally detailed garden notebooks, he really did most of Monticello in his retirement years. So in this letter on the other side, I love what he said. He said, I find that the limited number of our flower beds will too much restrain the variety of flowers in which we might wish to indulge. And therefore, I have resumed an idea of a winding walk with narrow borders of flowers on each side that would give us abundant room for a great variety. That was from June 7th, 1807. He still had 2 more years of the presidency. Now, I think we've kind of talked about what we've seen here already, but each bed, these areas were planted with a different flower so that there was really a big drift of the type of flower. And most of the seeds and bulbs had come from Bernard McMahon, who was a relatively famous nurseryman from Philadelphia. And he was the author of the American Gardener's Calendar. And he was, in many ways, Jefferson's gardening mentor. The flower gardens virtually disappeared after Jefferson's death in 1826. So if you think about it, that's a relatively short time for the garden to have been what it was in his retirement age. But they were revived and restored by the Garden Club of Virginia between 1939 and 1941. Researchers found Jefferson's sketches of the winding walk flower border and the oval bed plan. The oval beds, both here, and then they also had oval beds, well, the oval beds around the house. And we're going to be looking in a little bit more detail about those as we talk about some of the specific flowers. But so they had found the plans for them, and then they were able to observe the depression of the winding walk flower beds by shining the headlights of their automobiles across the lawn at night. I thought that was just so interesting because they were able to like figure out exactly where they had been because they parked their cars, shown the lights, and they were able to see where they had been. Of course, some of the perennial bulbs had continued to flourish in the border after 115 years. And they outlined a lot of the location as well. The restoration seems very accurate, especially considering the state-of-the-art landscape and garden restoration at the time. So now let's take a look at some of these flowers that would have been there in the spring. I did not see these and not seen these in person, only in pictures, which I took from the Monticello site. Thank you very much. So, of course, the borders were laid out in the spring of 1808. Tulips, hyacinths, anemones were among the flowering bulbs that they planted in 1807 to be blooming. And perhaps because they were so easily shipped long distances, bulbs did play a significant role at Monticello, and they still do. They plant them every year. You can just see how how wonderful they look in these drifts here. Reminds me of a lot of Washington, D.C. They plant these bulbs all over Washington in a lot of the areas by the monuments as well. The tulip, for example, was the most commonly mentioned flower in Jefferson's garden book. Many of these bulbs were florist flowers, so they were species that were highly refined through selective breeding by skilled European plantsmen. The winding walk and border is not a traditional garden, which we usually think of as a room outside or an enclosed retreat. His flower beds and borders are completely exposed to the elements, open to the central Virginia landscape, and balanced with what Jefferson called the workhorse of nature: clouds, hail, rain, thunder, all fabricated at our feet. The winding lines of the walkway reflects his interest in the latest informal style of landscape design, which he had admired back during visits to England and gardens in 1786. British garden architects attempted to imitate the picturesque scenes of 18th century landscape painters by removing some of the rigid lines of previous eras. Now, the flower gardens were not cared for by professional gardeners. This is one of my favorite parts, and this is where I really kind of come to the thought of heritage gardening and what it means to me and my heritage. But by Jefferson's daughters and granddaughters, who were often assisted by an elderly slave. Ellen Randolph recalled the heyday of flower gardening at Monticello. I remember well when he first returned to Monticello, how immediately he began to prepare new beds for his flowers. I was too young to aid him, but my sister was his active and useful assistant. The roots arrived, labeled each with a fancy name. There was Marcus Aurelius and the king of the gold mine, the Roman empress and the queen of the Amazons, Psyche and god of love, etc., etc., etc. Eagerly and with childish delight, I studied this brilliant nomenclature and wondered what strange and surprisingly beautiful creatures I could see rising from the ground. Then when spring returned, how eagerly we watched the first appearance of the shoots above ground. What joy it was for us to discover the tender green breaking through the mold and to run to Grandpapa to announce that we really believed Marcus Aurelius was coming up, or the queen of the Amazons was above ground. Then when the flowers were in bloom, we were in ecstasies over the rich purple and crimson, or pure white, or delicate lilac, or pale yellow of the blossoms. How he would sympathize in our admiration, or discuss with my mother and elder sister new groupings and combinations and contrasts. Oh, these were happy moments for us and him. I really remember all those kind of conversations with my parents and hearing my parents talk about daylilies that way. And just even now when I plant new things and wait for them to come up and see, oh yes, it did actually look like it was supposed to. Documentary evidence suggests that Jefferson grew approximately 105 species of herbaceous flowers. This is a big number, but it's likely that numerous species were not mentioned in his garden book and other memorandum. I don't know about y'all, but I've started to write down what I'm planting each year, and I know I'm not even half as detailed as Jefferson was. His garden books look like a spreadsheet. I mean, he was like the early Excel man. I only wish I could be as organized as he was. And this is after he retired from being president. I guess he had to have something to keep him busy. I'm only planting about 20 annuals a year and updating about 10 perennials. Meanwhile, Jefferson received a yearly shipment of as many as 700 species of seeds from, and I don't pronounce this well because I don't have a good French accent, but the Jardin des Plantes in Paris. Most years, the shipment was sent by Jefferson to even more devoted gardeners in America, but still many were surely planted at Monticello and not noted. Today, the species recorded by Jefferson provide the foundation for their flower gardens. However, flowers listed by Bird McMahon in his calendar are occasionally grown there as well. They plant the garden as many as 3 times a year. We've seen the spring bulbs on the last slide, and the tulips dominate the stage and probably unify the gardens more than any other time of year. In May, and when I would have given this talk originally, and until the middle of June, you get a lot of the numerous biennials and perennials from Sweet William to Canterbury Bells to Foxglove come into bloom. They are complemented by the flowering of old rose varieties as well as hardy annuals, plants that thrive in the long, cool Virginia spring, actually very similar to here in some areas of, actually here in Tennessee too, such as sweet pea, poppy, stock, larkspur, and calendula. By mid-July and often continuing through October, the warm season annual flowers rule the garden. And this is when I was there in September, and we'll look at some of the actual pictures I took. But this representation, which I grabbed off the website, kind of shows the whole area, probably a little bit earlier than September. It was beginning to die back some by the time I saw it. But the gardens include many of the species from which are now commonly grown annuals, including, of course, zinnia, geranium, heliotrope, French and African marigold, ageratum, and others. These plants reflect the undeveloped flowers that in some cases Jefferson would have known. Many of these plants have a low proportion of flower to foliage, particularly looking at this vista here, you can see that. Now there's a lot of green and just a little bit of the flower, but still it just makes for a wonderful palette. They're often leggier than modern forms, and some have simple single flowers. The effect is more like a wildflower garden, especially in August and September, as the plants grow up and set seed, which at Monticello they then collect, clean, and package to sell to you and me. Some of the ornamental species Jefferson grew in the 19th century were quite evolved, and that is they were doubled flowers, or their petals might be striped or fringed or mottled. And the restored gardens at Monticello include some cultivars of columbine, sweet pea, primrose, pink, and wallflower that were known in the early 1800s. In some instances, when a flower grown by Jefferson was highly developed, yet no longer available, the modern cultivars that look similar to those varieties are cultivated there. They do that with snapdragons, hyacinths, tulips, anemones, and child asters. So as I mentioned, this is a photo off the Monticello website at the height of summer with the flowers along the winding path. You see the wildflower nature of the plants. Let's look at some of these from back to front. First of all, I'd like to talk about the phlox back here in the back, the garden phlox. I love to see this because I have a stand of garden phlox at Mother's, which has been there as long as I can remember. It's probably 50 years old. And when I say Mother's, my mother's house, I still live at. In fact, I had it on the garden tour last year. I still go there and I care for its garden. So I'm one of the lucky people who has 2 gardens. So I've transplanted some of the phlox that are at my mother's house to my own home. But this is what it looks like at Mother's. Now, this is interesting because this is a picture from last summer. And it was doing pretty well. It's up above, you can see it's up above the wall. But this year, after, I've been so proud of it and saying it's been there for nearly 50 years, maybe 45. And this year it's almost not up at all. It's just pitiful looking. It certainly wouldn't be blooming yet anyway, but it's just very little of it has come up compared to the stuff that I took to my own house, which is doing great and getting ready to bloom anytime. But it looks terrible this year. And I don't know if when I took some to my house 2 years ago, if I cut something, but cut it back too much, or if it's just done its time. And I did actually see a picture. I was looking for other pictures in photo albums and saw a picture from when I was a child, and this garden phlox was much more vigorous even then. It was like up to this level. So I don't know if it's just been over time, been kind of dying back. So I might have to retransplant some of the stuff I brought over here back in there and see if I can make that more vigorous. So this next one up here is a spider flower, which I wasn't familiar with spider flower, but I was just really interested when I saw it. But so interested because of the way it looks up close at those the way the stems look like spikes or scales. And so you can see that up here when I showed this picture. Now I took this picture and you can see those spikes or scales. And I had to actually throw that into PlantSnap to identify that when I was there last September. So I just think that is a really fascinating look, and of course a great name for it. The other name for that is Pink Lady, if people are familiar with it by that name. So closer to us, we have these amaranths, or Love Lies Bleeding. And that is a picture I took of that. You can see probably a little bit difference in the cameras there, but you know, that's a curious summer annual cultivated in the earliest American flower gardeners. Of course, its name suggests these cascading red things. And I hadn't seen that one elsewhere. I've heard the name Love Lies Bleeding before. I feel like, I don't know, it seems like a lot of these are things you hear in Shakespeare as well. And then let's look at some of these other plants. We've got back in the back again, the black-eyed Susan, which is, of course, is very familiar to all of us. Cox Comb. I'm going to talk a little bit more Cox Comb on another slide because this is one that I had heard of but wasn't that familiar with. And then this is Prince's Feathers. When I was preparing this initially for my DAR chapter, I did not know what that was and had to have help figuring it out. And I think one of our fellow master gardeners helped me find the name of that. So I think that is a very interesting one. So next, let's take a little bit closer look at the Pink Lady or spider flower. This here where I took the picture, it was up here next to the house in one of the oval gardens. So they have it not just along the winding path, but here where the tulips were in that earlier picture. It was an annual that's native to the southern regions of South America and was introduced to England via the West Indies in 1817. To England in 1817, but we think it was growing here with Jefferson before then. So it was also called Spider Legs and Grandfather's Whiskers. It was considered a choice flowering annual by Robert Buist in his 1839 edition. That's, of course, after Jefferson died, of the American Flower Garden Directory. Its showy pink and white flowers, large multi-lobed ears, and strong growth habit. Just think about that being an annual and it growing up that fast in a single year. Makes it interesting for large beds in late summer and fall. It attracts bees and butterflies. It's deer resistant. I can see how deer might ignore that. And now to the right, you can get a better view of the Cox Comb, which of course is a form of celosia. And of course, this is the what did I call this? The Prince's Feather that we saw on the last slide. I love the other name for this, which is Kiss Me Over the Garden Gate. And Oriental, I can't pronounce this either, persicary. And it, of course, is a fast-growing, self-seeding annual. So it comes back again and again. And was first grown in Virginia by Williamsburg's John Custis in 1737. And then Bernard McMahon mentioned it in his 1804 seed list as Persicaria. Now, this is an Asian species, and it produces the pendulous clusters of bead-like bright pink flowers in summer above a robust and lush foliage. I like to point out where a lot of these things are from because we are all aware of the emphasis today on native plants. I'm certainly not against natives. I grow a lot. I love them. And I'm very much aware of invasive non-natives like privet and kudzu and Japanese honeysuckle. but many, many non-natives can live and grow happily along our North American plants without issue, and our garden certainly would be the poor if we did not have some of these other areas now blooming here. Anyway, on that photo on the right, near the house, you see the spider flower in the back. Yep, there's a spider flower in the back, and the princess feather, and then the cox comb. And I'm gonna, let's bring up the cox comb up close. Now, Thomas Jefferson noted the planting of seeds of cox comb, and he called it a flower like the princess feather, although I guess it is a little bit down here. I was gonna say, I don't think it is much, but I guess it is as it begins, in 1767. So 9 years before he wrote the Declaration of Independence, he was already talking about how he grew his flowers. Truly a multi-talented man. This crested form of celosia has strange scarlet combs that are furrowed and lobed. I'd heard of the coxcomb flower by name many years ago, but I really don't recall seeing it until after my mother died. Frankly, it was in the lovely flowers at her funeral, and I kept it and looked at it, and then ran into it again. I worked part-time for the census, and I was out at somebody's house, somebody's trailer, and they were growing this right in front of their trailer. And I remarked on it, and she gave me couple of the flowers that I took home. And of course, it does beautifully dried. You can just leave it, and it maintains almost as rich a color dried as it does here. And I kept it until I was ready to harvest its seeds. Now, if you look here, if you see my little red laser pointer here, the one on the left, you can see the teeny tiny black seeds in there. And you do have to kind of destroy the flower to get at the seeds. So after I'd gotten it and kept it for about 6 months, I pulled the seeds out of it and managed, of course, to take another 1.5 years to get those in the ground. I didn't manage to get those in until very recently, and I even forgot in the early spring. So I planted them in some pots, and I had just put the seedlings out in my garden, both at my mother's house and at my own house. So I've put them in 2 different places. This is a picture of them at my mother's house. And you can tell the leaves are the same, and they had very red stems when I first planted them. So I'm very hopeful that I'm going to get one of these by the end of the summer. So check back. I'm pretty excited about that notion. So now we're going to move on to a few things, other ones that I wanted to talk about. I did not see this when I was visiting, or didn't notice it. Or maybe I did. Actually, no, I think I did. But this was just a better picture that was, my picture of it was probably not as good. So this is 3-colored amaranth, or Joseph's coat. And it was mentioned by Jefferson in a shipment of seeds that he sent his brother-in-law, Francis Epps, from Paris in 1786. So when he's over there, working in Paris, he's like, oh, check out these, plant these. Very brightly plumed, tender annual, and it's grown for its vibrant yellow and red foliage, eye-catching display of color. Thomas Jefferson also talked about the cardinal flower, or Lobelia cardinalis. I pulled this one out because, well, I bought that as a native plant from the Reflection writing sale last year and failed miserably to grow it. It died. I never saw it, not a single red flower. It never grew and did not come back, unlike other things I planted that disappeared and come. So if I try that again, I will have to work a little harder on it. So the cardinal flower is grown at Monticello in one of the oval beds near the house. And they started that in 1807. So right, before he even came back from being president. So this native perennial was introduced to Britain in 1626. So obviously that's a plant people have been growing a while. Other people, not me. It was recommended for garden use by Jefferson's nurseryman friend, Bernard McMahon, in the American Gardener's Calendar in 1806. And the earliest American reference comes from John Bartram in 1783. At one time, this flower was used by Native American Indians as a root tea for treating stomach aches, typhoid, and other diseases. Cardinal flower is a hardy, except for me, North American summer flowering perennial, which has brilliant scarlet flower spikes. You can see what it looks like. So the next one, maybe I'll try again, put it in a container, then move it in. So anyway, the other flower I want to talk about was floss flower, and also known as ageratum. Ageratum is native to Mexico and Central America and was discovered by William Houston, who is a Scottish botanist. He lived from 1695 to 1733. Very short life, but at least he gave us some ageratum. He was a plant collector and ship's surgeon. Houston sent seeds to England in the early 18th century, and British author Philip Miller referenced the species in a 1768 edition of his Gardener's Dictionary. It was first documented in American gardens in 1836. This self-seeding species forms a spreading, loose-growing plant. Now, see, I always thought it was perennial because we do have that at my home I grew up in, but apparently it just is a vigorous self-seeder. There it is growing, and that it doesn't bloom until very late. That's an October picture from a couple of years ago of the ageratum or floss flower. And these are, you can see in the background all the daylilies that are done blooming. And actually I've even cut the phlox by that point. That's where the phlox is. But this is a very vigorous late bloomer. And it also works quite well in arrangements, as you can see there. So I happen to have that picture from an arrangement I had done. Now there are, of course, dwarf bedding types that are very popular now, but this is the type. The tall grower is the type that they have at Monticello, and that I have. Also, because the person who I consider this definitely a heritage plant. Not only is it at my childhood home, but the botanist who discovered was Scottish, and I am of Scottish descent on both sides. So definitely my heritage, and one I want to continue to grow if it doesn't die back like my phlox. All righty, so moving on, I want to talk about money plant, also known as honesty or Lunaria annua. Since I visited in September, I did not see any money plant. They had already cut it all back, I guess, which grows apparently along the winding paths. Latin name Lunaria, but if you look at these green discs, this is a picture of it from Monticello, and these green discs are why it's called the money plant. I, of course, well, and after the blooms are gone, well after the blooms are gone, the green seed pods turn transparent, and the covering blows off, and the seeds reseed for next year. Now, I discovered it was a biennial, and it only bloomed every other year, which I didn't know. So I was really worried last year when none of it came up. I'm like, well, the leaves came up and then none of them bloomed. And I thought, what have I done? I've killed this stuff somehow. But then this year it was back in force this spring. There's one picture of it at a stump, and you can definitely see the green disc on here. And this here is around an old bird bath. And then these are the leaves of it. This is the set of it that did not bloom this year. And those are even more vigorous now. And of course, I assume that they will all be blooming soon. Now, this was among the first European flowers grown in American gardens, and it was valued for its seed pods and edible roots. Seeing the small purple flowers on April 25th, 1767, Jefferson remarked, "Lunaria still in bloom, an indifferent flower." And I agree. It is not all that exciting, except in clumps. I mean, when you see it looking like that in the larger clumps, it's pretty good. And so when I did this brief originally, I didn't have any of the transparent discs to show. So I pulled this from Etsy to show people who might not know what it looked like once you've pulled the seed pods off. And of course, that was a little set of it. What is that? 4 stalks of it, I think. And that was on Etsy for $38. So I am excited that it's almost time for me to harvest my money plant, although I don't intend to sell it. This picture was taken today Well, today being June 25th, maybe around there. And I'm ready to probably cut that next week and let it dry out a little bit more before I carefully remove the seed pods. I do want to cut it soon because I don't think I really need to seed any more of it in my backyard here. You see, this is all non-blooming this year version of it. And they will be in great shape next year. So another flower that I found at Monticello that I have in my own backyard is one known as, well, my aunt called it mallow. This is the picture, the two pictures on the right are from my backyard, and this picture on the left is from Monticello. So I don't know if the difference in color is based on, well, probably my camera. But anyway, my aunt lives in Florida, and she does a lot. She can't grow a lot of things because it gets too hot there. So she does a lot of seeding perennials and bringing them into good shape, and then bringing them up to her daughter in Georgia and me in Tennessee, and letting us plant them in our gardens if we promise to send back pictures. So my mallow has done very well. It's interesting. It's been in about 3 years now, and like the first 2 years I had 2 big stalks, and now I have had about 4 or 5 stalks last year. It gets really tall, as in 15 feet tall. It gets big. This is a southeastern U.S. native, first named in the late 18th century, and was soon being grown by avid American gardeners of the day, notably William Bartram, George Washington, so I'm in good company here, and Gene Skipworth of Rappahannock in Virginia. Peter Collinson of London saw a painting of the flower done by Bartram and asked for seeds to be sent from Charleston, South Carolina. In spite of its early popularity and its use in hybridizing modern hibiscus cultivars there is little evidence that the species was widely grown in early American gardens. Also known as Star of Texas, but my Aunt Sarah, who grew it from seed and brought it to me, calls it mallow. And as I said, this stuff gets huge. And you see the seed pods are really evident here. I did harvest seed pods and send them to my Aunt Helen, who lives just north of Western Virginia. She forgot to plant them, so we don't know yet if it will grow there. So I'll have to send her some more this next year to see if that works out there. So now I want to talk about one of the plants that was the most popular during the garden tour when I had my family's home on the garden tour last year. This is Vitex, or Chase. This is actually a picture from last year, because I had put the name of it underneath here because everybody kept asking what it was, because it looks a lot like butterfly bush. I have since noted that there is a lot of Vitex in North Chattanooga. I've seen them all over, but they're just much smaller. This is a fairly large tree version of it. So I don't know how long it was sitting back there in the corner at my house growing up. I don't know exactly when my mother planted it, but she did note it in her own garden book. Also less extensive than Thomas Jefferson's, but more extensive than mine. But she noted that she had it originally at a house we were living in when I was born in Knoxville. So this was 55 years ago. And she really loved it there. And so she looked for it when she moved to Chattanooga and found one eventually through Winterthur, through the gardens at Winterthur. And I don't know why she couldn't find it in Chattanooga at the time, or maybe she did and she just saved the Winterthur card to say that's what she had gotten. But it is a very beautiful plant. This picture is from Monticello. And so in his weather memorandum book, Jefferson notes planting 9 rows of Vitex agnus castus, or chaste trees, on April 11th, 1807. I would like to have more of them. I don't think I have room for them anywhere, but one on the northeast side of the house and one on the west lawn next to the southeast pavilion. And he noted that it bloomed. Hold on a second. Excuse me. That its bloom is reminiscent of the butterfly bush. But its growth habit is more like a small tree. Not as invasive, of course, as a butterfly bush would be. Um, so I found it a remarkable and beautiful tree, and I enjoy more knowing that my mother sought it out for our home, and then it's been popular for a very long time, even with people like Thomas Jefferson. When I was at Monticello, I did not see any foxglove. This foxglove on the left is from one of the gardens near the house. I can see where the people are standing back here. That's one of the oval gardens near the house. I'm wondering what the purple flower is. It almost, well, no, it's not that. I'm not quite sure what that is. Someone else would probably know by looking. But anyway, so I have decided that foxglove is going to be my new thing. It's going to be my giving heritage to my girls, because my mother never tried to grow any foxglove at all. But I got a chance to visit England last year, saw it everywhere. I love it. This one is one I planted a couple of years back in a garden at my mother's house. I don't have any here at my own house. So I planted that one a couple of years. It bloomed very well this spring. It, of course, is biennial. But I planted a whole bunch more plants this year. Foxglove was grown in American gardens by 1735 and likely became more common after its medicinal properties were discovered in the late 18th century. And I'm sure y'all know digitalis is the Latin name for foxglove, and where we get lots of good important medicines for the heart, but also is a very poisonous substance if eaten directly. Philadelphia nurseryman Bernard McMahon, who we've heard a lot about today, listed both pink and white forms in his 1804 broadsheet. Can you imagine them going over the books just like we do in the thing to choose what to plant? And so this picture I took today, and you see the one that was in that first picture is over here dying back. But these are some of the ones I got this spring and planted. And then this is one I planted a few years back, and previously had the blooms all the way down, and they're kind of going back. Of course, also in this picture you see some of my coneflower, and this is some of the Rebecca or black-eyed Susan I actually transplanted from in the front of my house, and it has certainly bloomed vigorously this year. This in the foreground here is actually a form of bee balm. It's the also purchased at the native plant sale, and by golly, the damn thing better bloom this year. Didn't bloom at all last year. Nothing yet. It's already getting a little bit of the stuff that you get on all bee balm, which is escaping my mind right now, but y'all all know what I'm talking about. And so it's gotten very leggy, and we'll see if I get any. It has supposed to have a pink bloom, the native version of this. So, and my other red bee balm is blooming quite vigorously right now at my own house. So I'm a little disappointed in that. So moving along from foxglove, just wanted to show a little bit of what the up close of the flower gardens, because they did plant some more ornamental or some flowers that are things like sunflowers and stuff that grow alongside the vegetables. And I think they had some of their zinnias in this area too. This is more of an artist rendition, but I just love the folly here and how that looks. Just to be able to sit there and look out is just really, really beautiful. And of course, all of these flowers are just gorgeous. So here's an example of one of the sunflowers. And I just really liked the way they have them marked, 1806 and the Ericara, just the marking of them. And that looks almost like it's closer to a popsicle stick size, and it looks a little big in here because I've blown up the photograph considerably. But this Ericara sunflower is I just think a beautiful example of a flower that, maybe the leaves don't look that great, but wow, isn't that super? And the way they marked it. So a primary goal of the Thomas Jefferson sponsored Lewis and Clark expedition was, of course, botanical exploration of North America. In 1805, the members of the Corps of Discovery spent 6 winter months at Fort Mandan on the Missouri, near the Arikara, Hidatsa, and Mandan villages. The Arikara people planted these sunflowers as the ice broke on the Mississippi River, with soil temperatures at 45 degrees Fahrenheit, because the seeds will not germinate in the intense summer heat. Isn't that neat? I thought that was cool. Learn something new every day. Now, this is also another, hollyhocks were also grown in the vegetable garden area. And I'm sure you recognize these. I put seeds out this is at my own house. You can see the different color of brick there. And so I put seeds out last year, and I got beautiful, vigorous green. And of course, they're biennial, so I didn't expect them to bloom last year. So I was very excited. And of course, this picture was taken back in May. Now they're just wildly, everything has bloomed. And I had pinks and whites and reds, and some that were a little bit smaller. I'm not sure if they were a different variety I had in there or not. But I have also, this was pre-rust. I have now gotten a lot of rust on these, and I need to figure out what to do with that to make sure I don't get that back next year, or else I treat it more quickly next year before it becomes too ugly. But most of the flowers are still looking good, and they're very, very tall, just like this one here. Let's see, they were blooming that week back then. So the 1782, again, well before his presidency, garden book entry, Thomas Jefferson composed a chart of a calendar of the bloom of flowers that showed his Monticello hollyhocks flowering from mid-June through July. So mine were already blooming in May, and they're probably going to be, well, they're still blooming now, so they're still blooming here at mid-June, but I don't know that they'll last through July. We'll have to see. Hollyhocks are currently naturalized at Monticello, and again, like I said, they're in the vegetable garden, and are possibly descendants of those same plants that Jefferson observed in 1782. And that, to me, is kind of encapsulates the idea of heritage gardening, being able to see some of the same flowers and grow from the same seeds that, you know, not just our forebears and former presidents like Thomas Jefferson, but my parents and my aunts and uncles and my grandparents, and to be able to grow the same things they grew and enjoy them is part of what I consider heritage gardening, whether they be native or non-native plants, in either way. So I'm gonna just close out today with this quote from Thomas Jefferson. I'm pretty sure everyone's seen this, and I don't know that I'm going to be adding any useful plants, but I might be part of the people who is continuing useful plants. I basically have certainly never been xenophobic about my plants, and will guard against invasives, but but I also don't believe I'll ever stop trying to find different flowers that do well here in Tennessee, and enjoy their the process of watching them grow. One of the things I don't have enough time to talk about, or really the knowledge either, is to talk about the Chinese rose revolution, which is something I learned about when I was reading about all of the gardens at Monticello. But if you have an interest in that, I mean, this is really interesting how Chinese roses really changed the whole nature of what we were doing in roses back in the 18th century. So you may want to check that out at monticello.org. And I'd like to also credit that with a lot of the info and photos that I was able to use from there. Thank you for taking the time to listen to me today. And I appreciate Tom helping to tape this to make it something that more people would have an opportunity to see. Thank you.
That was very good. I really enjoyed it. There was a lot
good.
A few things about, I'd like to hear, if I was going to ask some questions, I'd like to hear a little bit about your background. You talked about growing up in Chattanooga, I guess, but did you go out to school or?
Okay. Well, Tom, I grew up here in Chattanooga. I was born in Knoxville, but we moved here and we moved into that house that I was showing a lot of pictures from in North Chattanooga when I was just 3 years old. So my family's been in that house for 52 years. I was only there till the first time until I went to college, went to Duke University and was on an ROTC scholarship. So I served in the Navy for 26 years and did a lot of my early adult gardening in Northern Virginia. I didn't do much. I did some gardening when I was stationed in Singapore and Italy, but mostly container gardening at that point. I didn't do a lot of getting into the yard too heavily, particularly in Singapore, because far too many spitting cobras for my taste. And we had gardeners to take care of all the beautiful tropical plants there. But definitely in my home in Northern Virginia, my mother was always bringing up daylilies, and I was trying zinnias and dahlias and kind of starting to experiment with gardening. But I moved back to Chattanooga in 2015 after retiring from the Navy in order to take care of my mother and have been, as I say, the managing gardener at 1012 Hanover since I've returned. Fortunately, my mother passed away 2 years ago, but the garden is absolutely something that I worked in from the time I was, 6 maybe till I left home, and it was great. My brother always laughs about the fact that when he left home, he's 3 years older than me, my parents hired a yard man to help them. When I left home, they hired a maid, but both of us worked very heavily in the garden. A lot of my labor is in that garden still, from pulling weeds for many years and doing all the scut work. But now it's certainly worth it to enjoy it, and it certainly built up in me an interest in gardens. And I did not start really getting into it till I was about 35, 36. And I think one of the things my mother did is spending time outside with children is kind of what got her into gardening, because she's like, okay, I'm not interested enough to do this, that, and the other, but I can be gardening and they can be playing. So that's one of the things that we have in common in that respect.